So let me just review the purpose of this series. If you weren't here last week, just briefly. I think that we have, in our churches, failed to preach the entire story of the Bible. We've got very lost in the New Testament, and in particular the gospel stuff, which of course is the whole climax of the story. It is the most essential part. Yes, 1,000%. But why it matters, we have to know what came before and we have to know what comes after. And we have not done a great job, particularly of knowing what comes before. We're New Testament Christians. We're New Covenant Christians. The Old Testament, it's boring. It isn't for us. And so we failed to know what's in there, and therefore failed to at times know the whole story on why the cross mattered at all and what really is taking place there. And I am going to, over the course of, I don't know if it'll be the whole year or most of this year, come in and out of this story, where we are looking basically Genesis to Revelation at the story of God, his divine desire, and how he has stayed relentlessly committed to it, and will be to the very end. Last week, we began before humans. We began in the heavenly realms, and we talked about supernatural beings, what the Old Testament calls Elohim, which, yes, is a word used for God, but it is a word used to describe all of the spirit beings in the Old Testament. We talked about God's divine counsel and some of the strange scriptures where it says that God rules over the assembly of the gods, or the bizarre passage in 1 Kings 22 where the divine council participates in God's decision to take down Ahab, where it's the whole assembly conversing with God on how are we going to do this. And so we talked about this desire for God to have a family that begins in heaven, but also then moves to earth, and that Eden was intended to be this intersection of heaven and earth, where there are supernatural beings, there are mortals like us, and this amazing, crazy Narnia-like place is actually what God's desire was. So we're moving from heaven, so to speak, and the supernatural, down into us today, and into the creation of humans, and how God made us, but more particularly why God made us. So I grew up in a house of 3 boys. And being in a house of 3 boys, one of the common things, especially at like family gatherings, like at Christmas and Easter when you're seeing the relatives you haven't seen for a while, was to be repeatedly told how much we all look like our dad. Oh, you look just like Craig, people would say. And as a boy, that was such a special thing to hear. I loved it. I loved hearing that I looked like my dad. My dad was my hero. And so looking like my dad, well, that gave me an idea of who I was going to be and where my life was going, and what type of adult and what type of life even I might live if I looked like my dad. It gave me a source of pride, it gave me a source of belonging, and it gave me definitely a source of identity. As I got older, I realized that though my dad and I do have a lot of resemblances, I do look like my dad, I probably look more like my mom. And that has also mattered to me. I'm proud to look like my mom. I'm proud to resemble her. I'm proud that my mom finally, got some credit for the 3 boys that she had a whole lot to do with. And so this morning we could go around the room and each of you could very quickly tell me which parent you look more like. Who do you resemble? And you're probably, maybe, proud to share that image with them. But the opposite may also be true. It may be that you resemble a parent that was not kind, or was not present, or did not treat you well, or you never knew at all, and yet you bear their image when you look in the mirror. And so maybe bearing the image of that parent is actually disappointing for you. It's not a source of pride, but, I wish it was different. Oh, well, what can I do? And then finally, parents, if you've had children, you know that it is really an incredible experience to bring someone into the world and go, oh my goodness, they look like me. They bear my image. You're a spitting image of your mother. We'll say things like this. And then it's even crazy when our children resemble other relatives. Like our daughter Macy looks quite a bit like my grandmother. And I've been told that one of my nieces looks quite a bit like me when I was little. And so what I'm getting at is bearing the image of another person is not inconsequential, for better and worse. Sometimes it hurts, sometimes it's beautiful, sometimes it brings glory, but it is not without impact. It never doesn't matter in one way or another. And if bearing the image of another human being, another person, is not inconsequential, then how much more important, with great consequence, with great implications, effect, is it that we would bear the image of God? Now, unfortunately, those who believe that God made us, and we confess that we are people made by God, created by Him, in His image, we don't really understand what that means. And then how and why that actually should influence the way that we live every single day. That isn't just a fun fact or an argument against, evolution, but that this is actually something that should affect me every day of my life. And then on a broader level, when we're talking about this whole big idea of God's divine desire and the story of God, why us bearing the image of God is a major part of the biblical story. And the fracture of that image and the repairment of that image and the ever-increasing pursuit of the image of Christ and Christ's glory in us is part of the story. And it begins with an image, and an image is broken, and then an image eventually repaired, and then a promise for eternity. And so I'm going to try, for the time we have today, to recover the significance of the truth that you and I are made in the image of God. Well, I probably could have you guess where we're going to go, but we're going to go to Genesis chapter 1, the beginning of the Bible, verses 26 to 28. We're not going to read the whole creation narratives, but just the beginning of the first chapter, the creation of Adam. Verse 26, then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created mankind in His own image. In the image of God, He created them, male and female. He created them. And God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. So by the time God got to creating Adam and Eve, there had been a lot of creating already going on. A lot of creating creatures. He made sea creatures and air creatures and land creatures and insects, which seem to have no boundaries. They don't know where they belong, whether in the sky, the sea, our homes. That's for another time. The point is, at the time of creation, the time when Adam came to life, Eden was full of life already. But at the same time, when Eden is already so full of God's good creation, God says, I'm going to make people. And He does it in a way that He's not created anything else. He makes people different from all of His creation by making them exclusively in His image, and then charging them with the task of caring for all of creation as though they are kings of it. Rule and subdue the earth is the job description of Adam and Eve. And if you're thinking, well, that sounds rather godlike, you're completely on the right track. It's completely godlike. It's in His image. And so God makes humans unique, which is amazing and it's interesting, but then there's a bigger question. And at least for me, who's more of an application guy, why did He do this? Why did God make us? And so sometimes before we understand why, it's helpful to know why not. And so let me get the why not out of the way. I've said it before, but it's so important that we understand this. So God did not make us because he needed our help or he needed us, okay? God didn't need us. Psalm 50, verses 9 to 12. We looked at this verse last week. He says, I have no need of a bull from your stall, or of goats from your pens, for every animal of the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird in the mountains, and the insects in the field are mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine, and all that's in it. Job 38:4, when God begins to address Job in his 37 chapters of complaining. And God says to him, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? O wise human. God didn't need us because he needed help getting his work done. I think at times we've reduced God to like the farmer who had a lot of farm chores. So he had, billions of children to help get the work done. God didn't need us to get the work done. And he didn't need us to create anything. God creates out of nothing, ex nihilo. He didn't need us to come along and just add to it a little bit. And then furthermore, God was not lonely. He wasn't in need of even relationship with us. God is completely, wholly alive in all of the need of emotion he would ever need, though God doesn't have need, within the Trinity, within the love of God. And furthermore, he's surrounded by the host of heaven. He has company. So he didn't need our help getting things done, and he didn't need our relationship. God was not lacking in any way when he said, maybe I could make some people and they would help and make me feel better. That's not our God. And yet he makes us. And so why does he make us? Well, here's the big theology. God made humans for his glory and for his enjoyment. God made us for his glory and his enjoyment. Isaiah 43, verse 7 says, everyone who is called by my name, whom I created for my glory, whom I formed and made. Psalm 149, verse 4, for the Lord takes delight in his people, and he crowns the humble with victory. Romans 11, 36, for from him and through him and for him are all things. To him be the glory forever. So God makes us for his own glory and for his enjoyment. So if we look at our own habits of creating, building, engineering, manufacturing, anything, it shows us some clues as to why God creates. And it shows us those clues because when we create, we're actually doing so as image bearers of God. So we create like God can create. Not in the magnificence of it, but in the same fashion. And so we know that when we create, we can say that it's fun to bring things to life. Literally, if you know what I mean. But also metaphorically. Anything that we can give life to and bring into existence, that's enjoyable. And even after something is created, it brings enjoyment through the glory of the thing and through our interaction with that thing. We enjoy the process of creating, and we enjoy the function or even the relationship that we may have with something that we've created. And then we also enjoy the blessing that that thing may be to others. Like God, we enjoy when we finish something and we can say it's good. That's good. And we're like this because God is like this. And God did not make us, as we've said, out of necessity, but for his enjoyment and for his glory. God is the master, church. I'm not living in this dichotomy or black and white, but of blending art and engineering in a way that is stunning, because I don't have a better word for it. Now, a major part of God's enjoyment of us is the relational aspect, that God relates to us, that there's fellowship. And you see, none of the creation before Adam and Eve had relationship with God the way we do. They were good and they were beautiful and he's proud of them. But there's not the relational aspect. God makes Adam in his image so he can relate to Adam. So that God and Adam could share thoughts with each other and plans with each other and love for one another, which God could not do with any of the world of nature. And that's why God made people for himself, to relate to them, for them to relate to him. And then furthermore, God makes us to include us in his work, just because he desired for us to join him in it. Not because he needed it, but because he wanted us. Just join me. It's no different than if you've invited a son or a daughter or someone younger or less skilled than you to participate in a project. And you know they bring nothing to it. In fact, they may slow you down. But you want them there. You want them there to do that task, whatever it may be, with you, just because you like to share it with them. And then finally, there's this aspect of God making us for his glory. And I think we understand this too, because we, like God, know the glory of a good job. Credit for something, appreciation for something is a good feeling, even when we're falsely humble about it. It's still a good feeling. If you don't believe me that we have a tendency to love credit and glory, consider how as a society we fight over copyright. It is the law in our land to give credit. You have to credit people. You cannot steal their glory or their paycheck, another form of glory. We have laws that protect against stealing intellectual and creative property. Schools have severe punishment for not giving the glory to who the glory is due. We want credit because we want the glory and we want the pay in some way or another. And so if you want to know why God made you, the answer at the most basic level is because he wanted to enjoy you. And he wanted to receive glory amazingly from your existence. And then from that foundation, then we can look at some other reasons that then we can go, okay, and then God also sees purpose in these ways, which is why I exist. So another reason then, building off that foundation, is God desired for it to be on earth as in heaven. We talked about this last week, but it is critical to understanding this whole story of the Bible, that God wanted it to be on earth like it is in heaven. So back to our Genesis text. God created mankind in his own image, in the image of God. The image of the maker of heaven and earth. He created them, male and female, he created them, and he blessed them, and he said, be fruitful and increase in number, and fill the earth and subdue it. So God wanted a family to participate in his work. We talked about this last week. He wants a family to act as his representatives in his work, and he wanted that on earth just like he had in heaven. And so when God says that he wants heaven on earth, when he wants to create earth as if it is like heaven, that's not about its ethereal, aesthetic. This is about the function of it. It's more about being the place where God's representatives carry out his work, just as his representatives carry out his work in heaven, they do on earth. It's about doing it in his character. It's about doing it in his name. That's what heaven on earth is about. It's not about bliss and euphoria the way we've made it. It's more about people doing it for God, like God, because of God. Michael Heiser, who I've said will guide a lot of my thoughts for the first chunk of this series, says like this. He says, think of the image of God as a verb, and you understand a bit better why God made us. I am made in God's image doesn't speak to the thing, it speaks to the action that produces. God made us in his image, and he charged humans with the task of doing what? Ruling and subduing the earth and all of creation within it. I think that it's safe to say that it wasn't God's desire that heaven and earth would be as separate from each other as we often make them to be. God's desire was something far more intersectional, Something that is what Eden was like, essentially. A place not quite heaven as we understand it, but not quite earth as we know it to be either. An intersection of heaven and earth. The supernatural and the natural, and God as Father, because He's Creator, as Lord over all that He has made supernatural and natural. And God's desire from the beginning has been then to unite that heavenly family and that earthly family in a perfect, harmonious world in which He's Father and Lord. And the thing is, He's still committed to this desire. He's still committed to bringing this to pass. This is not just what He wanted, this is also where we're going, because it broke and He's repairing it. Now, if God made us in His image, and the image of God then is much more of a verb than it is a noun, because heaven and earth are to be very similar, putting all this together, then what does that mean for us today? It means that knowing we and every other person is created in God's image should in fact cause us to live differently. Michael Heiser goes on to say this: it may not seem like it, but a lot of life-changing ideas extend from all of this. Living consciously as though our lives represent God and further His plans, even if we don't yet see that plan, would change the way we approach every day, each day. Wayne Grudem, brilliant theologian, adds this: as creatures made in God's image, we were made to be like Him. Therefore, the more we understand about God, the more we understand about ourselves. And the more we understand about ourselves, the more we understand about God. So how would our lives change if we lived under the awareness that we are made in God's image? What would be the effect of that conviction taking root and actually being something we consider more than the 2 times a year when we read Genesis 1? First of all, and this is a big, important thing, we have identity that gives us purpose. Isaiah 43, I said to Pastor Brand this week, I think this is becoming, at the moment, my favorite verse in the Old Testament. Isaiah 43:1, but now this is what the Lord says: He who created you, Jacob, He who formed you, Israel, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name. You are mine. It's amazing what happens to a person when they become convinced they are wanted and they are desired and that they belong. That's true of friendships, and it's true of family, and it's true of sports teams, and it's true of church family. You know, this is one of the reasons that street gangs are so appealing to teenagers, is because they prey on the teenagers that don't belong and don't have any purpose and don't have any identity and don't feel like they matter. And so suddenly they now belong, and now they have a reason to live, and now they have things to do, and they have people that appreciate the work. And so then how much more impactful when we become convinced we exist for no other reason than God wanted us and we are His. That God having a family is His greatest desire. How much more confidence do we walk in when we become convinced that we are not accidents and we are not mistakes? And I love saying this, that we are not random clusters of cells that manage the almost impossible task of breathing and becoming a human being. But we are created and formed by the highest God because He wanted us, and you are mine. That's why you exist. It's not because of the way you look or what you can accomplish for me. It's not how Christian your family was that makes me love you. I just wanted you for my enjoyment and my glory. And that's not just true, dear church, when we're doing well. That truth remains upon us when we fail, when we make mistakes, when we sin, when our relationships are broken, when we mistreat others. God still feels this way about us. And I'm certain that whether you are a teenager here today, a child, or a senior citizen, this truth is never not needed. There are certain themes in the Bible that I go, if I preach on that, that will touch hearts. I just know, because I'm a human being. Now, this obviously is going to produce a secure identity. I know who I am. But it also gives us a really special purpose that's rooted within that identity of who I am. And that purpose is to treat God's creation, all of it, but especially people, as his representatives. Reminding others of this truth that impacts us and hits us in the heart. You know, have you ever considered that you're called to love your wife as if she's made in the image of God? I mean, we get all these goofy men's seminars on like how to be a good husband. And like, good enough, fair enough. I know what you're getting at, but here's a good place to start. She bears the image of God. Ladies, if you are married, you are to love your husband as if he is made in the image of God. We don't even have to get to Ephesians and figure out all the household roles. How about just love them like they're made in the image of God and see what happens? Thank you, Chris. Reminding our kids that their skills and their talents and their education and their career one day and their eye color and their haircut and their genes are not what makes them valuable. The image they bear does. And that's our purpose, to tell the world that. Start at home, go to work, do it here amongst other believers. And some people do this really, really well. And they serve as great examples for how we should and can do this. One of those people was Fred Rogers. A few years ago, a documentary came out on Fred Rogers, more commonly known as Mr. Rogers, from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And the documentary, if you've not seen it, I'd say watch it. It tells in multiple touching details how this man spent not just his career, but really his life telling children that they were special and that they were loved and that they were important just as they were. Mr. Rogers understood that children, which we all were, grow up feeling unseen. And they grow up feeling unloved, which produces adults at times like us, with no sense of belonging and no sense of acceptance, no sense of value and no sense of worth, and then these people tend to hurt people. So Mr. Rogers, rather than saying, let's wait and deal with them when they get to 40 and they've been through 2 divorces and they're an alcoholic, let's try to deal with them when they're 4. And maybe we can save them then. Now, Rogers didn't come to this conviction because he was some kind of humanist just celebrating the beauty of mankind. He was actually very aware of the sinfulness of human beings. He came to this conviction because he was an ordained minister. And I'm sure some of you knew that, but he was ordained within the Presbyterian Church in the United States. And so he believed deeply in the inherent worth of every person as an image bearer of God. So one powerful example of this is how Rogers loved a boy named Jeff Erlinger, who had a severe disability. Some of you may have seen this clip before. It's pretty powerful. I don't actually have the clip, but it floats around. And Jeff was invited to be a guest on Mr. Rogers' show to visit the neighborhood. And Jeff was in a electric wheelchair in the 1980s where this wasn't as common, and disabilities and handicaps were much more taboo, and we weren't as, generous and tolerant with acceptance and all these types of things. And so we had him on his show to basically show the world, expose the world to those who are different, but also to care about this little boy. So he gets him to demonstrate how he uses his electric wheelchair, and they sing some songs together, actually songs about worth, value. Then the show ends and he says, "Give my best to your parents, they're good people," and he drives away. And then after that show, Jeff Erlinger says, I don't know exactly at what time he said this, I suspect not immediately after, But upon reflection and probably some maturing, he said that in that moment he realized that he mattered to Mr. Rogers, but more importantly, that he mattered to God. So Fred Rogers is this incredible example of a person who helped adults, who's still helping adults, both children and adults, understand their value and their place in God's world as God's creation, because he made them because he wanted them. Now, as I tell that story, if you have a pulse and you feel any kind of feeling about that, I am certain it's not the beautiful, kind little story. That is the heart of God that we encounter when we hear that. It's not just about kindness. There's a presence of God that exists in actions like this that we still feel. It's a reflection of a loving God who made us and knows his people. 18 years after that TV episode aired, a grown-up Jeff Erlinger surprised Mr. Rogers with an appearance on stage at his induction into the TV Hall of Fame. It's not a great picture. It was hard to get a big enough one, but the impact and the relationship, though 18 years later, as you can see, had not diminished. And so again, though it was the life of Fred Rogers who impacted Jeff Erlinger with the power of love, it was ultimately the heart of a loving God that Jeff was experiencing. And so Fred Rogers understood that his identity and his purpose as an image bearer of God required him to live a certain way and do some things. And that wasn't just a theological insight, because we could all leave here today going, oh yeah, we're made in God's image. Isn't that a wonderful thing to think about? But he did more than theological insight with it. He started to live it out, this embodied incarnational conviction. And in his Hall of Fame speech, minutes after that picture, to that secular world, he said, by doing whatever we can to bring courage to those whose lives move near our own, by treating our neighbor at least as well as we treat ourselves, and allowing that to inform everything we produce. When we come to know God's desire for us, we without a doubt come to know, as Mr. Rogers says, courage. You see, there's no insecurity, there's no words or actions of another person, there's no act of our father or mother, there's no betrayal of a loved one, there's no criticism of our most consistent critic, and Lord knows we have them. There is no memory, there is no failure, there is no anxiety strong enough to rob us of the audacious courage that comes when we know for certain that God has made us for himself. And we all need it. And because we all need it, I think that's a clue that we all need to be reminding each other of it regularly. Reminding them of whose image they bear. God knows we tear this down on each other plenty. I want to add this practical challenge for all of you who are not pastors. Brian, you can step away for a moment if you need to. Church, as a pastor, I notice something in our world. Those who work outside of the church tend to have a habit of compartmentalizing our lives with a lens by which we view others and our daily purposes as something like an appointment in our calendar. I'll get to it when I have time. I'll do the Christian thing when I have time in my schedule. And I think far too often what we do then is we have Christian stuff and work stuff and family stuff and recreation stuff and stress stuff, and we have happy stuff. And we can only do the Christian stuff in the Christian stuff moments. I'm too stressed right now. Well, I'm on vacation. And while I understand and I appreciate that, yes, I probably have more time to read and pray and study the Word of God than you do, I do not have more opportunity than you do to do this. And I will argue until I am blue in the face that I don't have as much opportunity as you do. I'm here ultimately telling a room full of people something that they could have already known because they've been told to know it. You will get to go back to work tomorrow and be with a whole bunch of people that don't know it. You have an opportunity every day to do whatever you can to bring courage to those whose lives move near your own. By treating your neighbor at least as well as you treat yourself, and allowing that to inform everything your life produces. You have every opportunity. You are surrounded by a world every day that needs to know courage by way of whose image they bear, needs to know grace, needs to know mercy and kindness, who needs to know joy in a joyless world for most of the time. You know, the role of the pastor, according to Paul in Ephesians 4, is to build up the church for works of service. Which would suggest to me two things. I have a very important job, and so do you. If we want to go who does what here. And this doesn't mean I don't do this when I'm not here. I go to the grocery store, I go to the gas station, my kids have teachers. I have all kinds of opportunity to do this too. That doesn't happen here. And so do you. But I think, again, that Christians create this personal little secular society and culture. And you know, secularism is the society or culture without God. And so we create these for ourselves, and then we excuse it by pointing to broader secular society and saying, I don't have a choice. I can't preach in the office. I'm not going to lead prayer before my board meeting. And that's true. You probably can't do those things. But that doesn't mean God doesn't regularly give you opportunity to treat someone as if they bear the image of God. And to love your neighbor at least as much as you love yourself. Michael Heiser goes on to say that God doesn't view people in ministry as more holy or special because of their job descriptions. God cares about how each of us represents Him where we are, because we're all image bearers, no more, no less. So we either stand against the darkness, sharing the life that God wants everyone to ultimately experience, or we don't. The opportunity doesn't need to be spectacular, it just needs to be taken. So maybe a great question to ponder. And you know, preaching experts would say, don't ask these rhetorical pondering questions. Give them something concrete. But how would our lives change if we lived with the constant awareness that everyone we meet bears the image of God? Which, again, is not just a theological experiment. That is a daily challenge. Imagine how different our conversations and our communities and our world would be if every person approached every person as if they bared the image of God. Now, of course, we don't have to do this. God, in fact, does not force us to do this. But we can. We don't have to, but we can, or we cannot. Which leads to my final point on what it means to be made in God's image. Bearing God's image means that we have free will. So God creates them, and then in Genesis 2, we see the Lord commanded the man, you are free to eat from any tree in the garden, but you must not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, for when you eat from it, you will certainly die. In God's desire for genuine relationship with humans, He granted us free will. And He gave us the freedom to choose which ways we will walk in them. In Deuteronomy, it says, I place before you life and death, blessing and curses. Choose. Choose. And like the host of heaven, this divine council we talked about last week, we are invited to participate in God's work willingly. And we are empowered to make choices that align with his divine purposes, yes, while under his guidance and his sovereignty, but we don't have to. Just like the host of heaven didn't have to. The host of heaven rebelled, and so did humans, because God gave us free will. You know why God gave us free will? Because it's the way that we tell him that we love him. If God forced us to love him, it's not actually love. It's not actually relationship. And so he said, I'm going to give you the choice to love me, and then I'll know. And then you know what else he says? He says, and I'll know that you love me by the free will to obey me or not. But free will also allows us to rebel against God and reject him and tell him that we do not care about the image that we bear and the purposes that come with that. And some in heaven and earth go as far as to even saying, I'm going to tear that image down in people. And this is where we're heading next week, that though the host of heaven and the humans of earth rebelled, though created in God's image, they rebelled. Though created to participate in God's work, they rebelled. Though created for God's enjoyment, they rebelled. And yet God's commitment to the desire to have a family never went anywhere. And it's been put on display for millennia. And that's a little bit of where we're going next week. So your sermon in a sentence. It's hard to reduce everything I've just said to a sentence, but when we understand that we are made in God's image, we begin to understand our true identity and our purpose in life. And my simple prayer wish for you today is that every single one of you would first and foremost have, if you haven't already, received a fresh deposit of courage because of that precious reminder that you are God's desire. So much so that he put his image on you. And he will stop at nothing until that image is fully repaired. In every single one of us. If we will have it. And as we step back into our daily routines, starting in 8 minutes, let's not only see these people as people, but treat them as sacred. As reflections of God. Let me pray for you.